Aloha. I'm Bianca Frogner. I'm your first speaker for today in this session called House Poor No More, Disrupting the Difficulty of Finding a Home in Hawaii for Health Professionals. It is an honor for me to be here today. I am accompanied by our lunch keynote speaker, Len Nichols. So I'll be starting off first and then handing off the microphone to him. Again, thank you so much for having me here today, and I hope everyone can hear me okay in the back. Yes, okay, great. And hopefully folks online can also hear me. And just as a reminder for anybody, the slides are available online. So especially those joining us online, if you can't see my slides, they're there. So just a real quick introduction. My name is Bianca Frogner. I'm a professor at University of Washington in Seattle. I direct the Center for Health Workforce Studies, which is housed in the Department of Family Medicine and has been there for a little over 20 years. We are not physician specific in our work. We at the Center for Health Workforce Studies, we examine a number of health professionals nationally. And so we really care about a lot of issues around career paths of our healthcare workers and dive a lot into the who of our healthcare workers. So it's an honor today to be able to share a little bit of some work and building off some of that that we've done in the center around understanding who, how transportation and commute patterns kind of relate to housing. And then I'll be handing off this lecture to Len, who will talk a little bit more about the actual solutions, because I'm a little better at identifying problems, of which there are many. So I'm going to start off here, if I can. Hold on, I have a clicker. Some direction. Hold on. I don't seem to be able to move in any direction. Oh, there we go. It wasn't even moving for that. Okay. So this is just a quick a snapshot of something that we have actually on our website. We've been at the Center for Health Workforce Studies, and we've been looking at data out of the American Community Survey. The American Community Survey is basically the long form of the census. It's one of the best data sets actually we have available nationally that helps us monitor what our healthcare workers look like, including all sorts of personal information, such as where do they work and where do they live and commute patterns and things like that. And so we've been spending a lot of time with that data. We have an interactive map where you can kind of get a sense of where people work and where they live. And really the bottom line story is that about 10 to 20% of healthcare workers nationwide really do not live and work in the same neighborhood. And this is including here in Hawaii. However, what's really challenging is that we really finding out where exactly people work and where people live here on the islands is really difficult, because we cannot disaggregate at a very detailed geographic level where people are working and living. This is one of the challenges of having public data, but I'm sure that it's probably true here as it is elsewhere that many people do not work and live in the same community. Many of our healthcare workers on the mainland drive to work, and I did look to see what it was like here in Hawaii to see what percentage of people were saying that they drive to work versus taking other forms of transportation like subways or bus or ferries. And it is the case that here on the islands that we do have see that healthcare workers, and this is across all the different kind of professions, certainly do drive more often than in the mainland. There are some limits in terms of how we even think about commuting and how these questions are asked, because they really, as a respondent to this survey, you really only pick one option in terms of how you commute. Now, personally, I commute by many forms of transportation, and I'm sure many of you do too. I take a car to a ferry, to a van pool, and then I walk. So my commute is about an hour and a half each way. And personally, I do live on another side of the water than Seattle, Washington. So I do have to cross that body of water. But when I think about how would I respond to such a question as this, I'm not so sure which one of the many forms of transportation I would answer. So it is important for us to understand how people are getting to and from work so that we can understand what are the available modes of transportation even close to people in terms of where they might live. And that's why I'm kind of emphasizing this kind of point that people work and live in different places and they take different forms of transportation. And I think one point in particular is that what we noticed, at least on the mainland, is that, while cars are certainly an option for people who might have the ability to afford a car and afford or high gas prices, a number of our healthcare workers, particularly in aid and assistant positions like home health aides, nursing assistants, medical assistants, oftentimes rely on public transportation like buses and trains and subways. And when I think about here on the island, I notice that while buses are a possible form of transportation, I notice that there's a subway line that looks like it's being built between here and at least the airport. And I imagine this is a conversation here is, you know, what are the other forms of transportation people might be able to take? Because that does dictate what is the available housing supply people would be able to take advantage of if there aren't houses here locally. And I do want to note that it does take people on an average, healthcare workers on average, about 24 to 30 minutes per day, I think this is each way, to be able to get to their place of work. And that's not an insignificant amount of time. It's not like people necessarily work within a 5-minute walk away from their jobs. Now, we do know that housing is a limiting factor for both rural and urban communities. Now, I know we talk a lot about that in urban areas, but it does certainly, it is an issue in rural areas. And one of the ways, at least in Washington state, I just want to point out in terms of how we've understood housing as a limiting factor is that we actually survey our employers, healthcare employers in the state of Washington on a fairly regular basis through something called the Sentinel Network, where employers kind of tell us what are the challenges their healthcare workers are facing and why they're struggling with vacancies and shortages. And through our Sentinel Network, we do often see housing mentioned oftentimes as a factor for employers in both rural and urban areas. Now, the issues are slightly different based on if you're in rural versus urban areas. For urban areas, it is oftentimes the cost of housing that is an issue. In rural areas, it's less about the cost of housing, but it's more of a neighborhood factor. So the house might not be located in a neighborhood that has like the best schools, and on top of that, just even the cost of housing relative to their pay might not quite equate. So it is an issue for both of the areas, although the underlying motivating factors are slightly different. I did do some mining of the American Community Survey to better understand what home ownership does look like for our healthcare workers in this state of Hawaii and compared to the rest of the US. And it does seem to be the case, at least in this survey, although it is a little counter to, I think, what Len mentioned earlier, which is that, and maybe it is the same, just maybe a slightly different segment of the population that I was looking at, is that healthcare workers in Hawaii, all healthcare workers, are a little bit more likely to own a home compared to other healthcare workers across the US. Physicians also are slightly more likely to own a home compared to physicians in the rest of the US. However, there are a couple key things to really note, which is that all healthcare workers in Hawaii are a little bit less likely to be mortgage free, and that's even the case even for physicians. And then when you actually look at their monthly mortgage is about 60% higher for all healthcare workers in Hawaii. And for physicians, it's about 30 to 40% higher than the rest of the US. And then among those who are renting, the monthly rent for all healthcare workers here in Hawaii are paying about 60% also more in rent monthly compared to workers outside in the rest of the US. And physicians also are paying higher rent. So both mortgage and rental payments are higher here in the state, and that might not be so surprising, but it is, I think, particularly notable that those who are outside of physicians, so these are your nurses, your medical assistants, et cetera, they are paying 60% more higher. And these are probably those who have slightly less wages than the physicians. So I think that's just an important thing to note. So what are we doing about this? You know, as Len spoke about earlier today at lunchtime, I mean, we have to invest in housing, and it just does take partnerships. And it is worth noting that in several cities, local smaller communities around the country, they're trying to get creative. And one of the things that kept popping up is the use of motels or rundown motels and reconfiguring them into some kind of workforce housing for those who need it. So creating affordable housing. So in the Seattle area, affordability of housing is certainly a problem. And so a town called Anacortes, which is a little bit north of the city and close to a series of beautiful islands up there, not quite as beautiful as Hawaii, but nonetheless our version of islands. They've turned in a motel there into some kind of a workforce housing. A couple ski resorts out in Colorado, in Breckenridge and Summit County, they also bought an old hotel and made these into workforce housing. Now, specifically in Nantucket, we saw actually that a hospital bought some duplexes and made that into employee housing. And in Miami Beach, there is a discussion about building some new housing for healthcare workers. And I think what's worth noting is that in all of these examples, while the one that I'm mentioning here that says hospitals are buying duplexes, that is clearly within the healthcare realm, all the other examples named healthcare workers as one of their target audiences for why they were buying up and developing these kinds of units to become houses for healthcare workers. Now, the specificity around how they were able to acquire it, or how at the end of the day, there's what's the average rent, or if there's any opportunity to ever have equity in these places, that I did not see specified, but I did find it interesting that this is certainly being discussed. And actually, one of the leading groups that tends to have these kinds of discussions are workforce development boards. And every state does have a workforce development board that's funded out of the Department of Labor. In Washington State, we are very much an active partner with our workforce board, where they have a healthcare specific group where we discuss healthcare workforce issues. And those development boards are ones who bring together a number of stakeholders from all sorts of entities to think about how we can support our healthcare workers. And they're somewhat behind some of these discussions that are happening around these other places around the country. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Len so he can talk a little bit more about, well, what can we actually do? How can we actually make some of these changes happen? I do welcome you to check out our Center for Health Workforce Studies. I don't do this work alone. I do this work with a number of other people, and I just want to acknowledge their work behind it. So thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion later.
Okay, well, thank you, Bianca. And we'll try to keep this brief because we certainly think this should be interactive as we go forward. Can you hear me okay? Are you good? I picked the picture because I like the monopoly metaphor, because you may remember at the end of the day, the number of houses and hotels in monopoly is limited. And at the end of the day, you might have to bid them up, and that's kind of where we seem to be. First thing I want to say is it's not just a health workforce problem. We basically, you can't see the timeline there. That's housing starts per 1,000 households by year, and they have it sort of by decade. We stopped reproducing our housing stock about 1980, and we almost came back to doing so about 2009, and it fell back down. And we're now about 3.8 million units short in the United States for housing stock. So it's not just a Hawaii problem, and it's not just a healthcare workforce problem. One study that is from which I took this wanted to be clear that one of the main reasons there seems to be this huge housing shortage across the country is local zoning and land use restrictions. I do not know how important they are in Hawaii. I hope you can tell me that in the discussion that follows. But essentially, the deal is a lot of places say you got to have a minimum lot size, and a lot of places say it can only be single family housing. And of course, at the end of the day, when you think about it for 30 more seconds, the people who benefit from that are existing homeowners, and their housing values are, they think, driven up by those provisions. And that's where you get very strong opposition to relaxing those provisions sort of after they go into place. So the trick is, don't let them go into place in the first place. If it's too late, then you're going to have a political problem. But at the end of the day, that's the economists who look at this stuff, I'd say closely, say these two provisions are very important in perpetuating a housing shortage around the country. Now, what's kind of exciting in my view is what Bianca started to talk about, some examples. Employers have figured out if they don't supply some kind of housing solution, they're not going to be able to attract workers. And this particularly became acute during the end of COVID in resort and vacation kinds of places. And so in the Catskills and the Poconos and all those kind of places, they figured out we've got to supply housing in a way we never did before to get workers to come back and go to work. And so that's really what's going on around the country. And so the housing crisis and the labor shortage, which I'm sure you've heard, the Great Replacement, the Great Resignation, all that stuff, that's going on. And employers in particular, have figured out housing affordability and wages are deeply linked. And if you're going to get people to come back and work for wages close to what you were paying before, you're going to have to make housing affordable as well. And so I'll just say what a number of employers are starting to talk about is thinking about solving these two problems together. That is your labor shortage and your housing shortage at the same time. So some specific ideas for Hawaii, obviously, and I assume this is done now, but maybe not. If not, it ought to be done pretty much this afternoon. Every healthcare organization of some size should have a housing assistance coordinator. There are a lot of programs, federal, state, even local, that folks don't know about that you could be eligible for. And I'm no expert on them. I'm happy to talk about the logic of some of them, but at the end of the day, there's lots of ways to get subsidized housing or subsidized access to housing if your income is low enough. And while that won't be relevant to physicians per se, and maybe not even nurses, it could be highly relevant to a lot of those folks listed on that chart you couldn't see from the Hospital Association that had medical assistants and phlebotomists and all kinds of med techs and stuff like that. And I would say, if you want to really get serious about solving the problem, you're going to have to think about multifamily construction and some kind of sliding scale rent or even rent to own kind of options, which, by the way, is the way most of the world was constructed, but not so much the way the American image of itself, the American dream tends to be. So I mentioned one example before about these shared equity solutions, and I will go through some of them in a little more detail right now, and then we want to open it up for your questions and discussion and ideas. But essentially what shared equity is about finding a way to reduce the down payment and or the monthly payment in exchange for sharing the equity in the property. And if you think about it, it's a way to enable purchasing that couldn't happen otherwise. And you could apply it to almost any population. But the fundamental goal is to reduce the down payment and or the monthly payment, and typically both. Because if you reduce the down payment, then you reduce the mortgage you have to finance. And if you reduce that, you reduce the monthly payment in and of itself. Also, if you reduce the down payment, typically you can get a lower interest rate because the amount you're borrowing is lower, et cetera. So there's sort of a number of different sort of piggyback advantages of doing this. I mentioned Stanford was the first to do it in the United States in the 80s. A number of universities do it now. And if you think about it from a university point of view, right, doing it for a tenured faculty member is zero risk to the university. And you allow the university to, in essence, participate in the housing market. So it's a good investment for their portfolio. And at the same time, you're making it possible for faculty to actually live near the campus, which a number of places actually think is a good idea. So that's why it's sort of win-win. And so if you think about it, if it's true that way for universities, why is it not true for insurance companies, hospitals, et cetera? Now, there's a program called landed.com, which was, it's a for-profit thing. It was created to target these kinds of shared equity arrangements for teachers. One of the populations that has the most difficulty finding affordable housing, particularly in urban areas, is teachers, because we don't pay them enough, of course. And landed.com, it's interesting, when I first put these slides together for Kelly, and that was, I don't know, May when she talked to us the first time, landed.com was going strong. Since then, apparently there's been some interest rate increases by the Fed, which have driven up what landed.com has to pay. And so they now have everybody on a wait list. So landed.com, but you should go there and look at it because they have a number of different projects and products, and you could see what they've done. And again, those kinds of arrangements in general in the shared equity world can be made applicable to any profession or any kind of target group. There's another interesting innovation that I think has a number of appeals for a Hawaii context, and that is what's called community land trusts. And community land trusts have been used by cities essentially to take public land and have housing on it, right? And essentially what you do is you sell the house to your target person, be it a teacher, fireman, nurse, whatever. You sell it to the target person at, let's just say 40% below market. All right. And you, in essence, allow people to enter the housing market at way less cost to them than the pure market rate would require. And the trick is, then your requirement is to resell it whenever you resell it 10, 20 years later at 60% of market again. So you, in essence, create a permanent affordable housing stock that way, and you start with public land. It's something that cities have done in various parts of the country, and something, given the amount of land y'all may control, that could be a very good solution for Hawaii. I'll close with this last little example, and I didn't want to get into the truly gory details, but this is a simpler version of a shared equity arrangement. This example comes from Lending Tree. And by the way, these shared equity things are not just university type things. Real banks, you know, real financial institutions have entered in them as well, because they have come to see, again, if the borrower is fundamentally credit sound, but they just can't buy these ridiculously high prices right now, well, then enabling them to get into the market at a lower price point may make it mutually beneficial for everybody. Remember, the world's not zero sum. And so there are private examples of doing this independent of an institution, which may have some more publicly oriented purpose. But the basic example I want to walk you through is, imagine the home costs $200,000, and I realize that's not realistic for Hawaii, but you know, it's America, so they picked something out of Alabama. So $200,000 is a housing price. The buyer might put up 10% down. The shared equity lender would put up 10% down. So they both put 20,000 toward the 200,000 purchase. That gets you, if you're doing the math, a 20% down payment, which will typically get you a lower interest rate, right? And a 10 or a 5% down payment. So again, that's going to be mutually beneficial. The mortgage lender still is loaning 160,000, right? So, and again, the mortgage lender could be a completely independent third party. It could be somebody who's also doing the equity part. But then look in the final column in the future home sale. So suppose 10 years from now, whatever, you sell it for 300,000, and the buyer who put up 20 would net 110, right? Because they get the 300,000 sale price. They have to pay 30,000 to the shared equity lender. The shared equity lender gets their 20,000 back plus 10% of the appreciation. So another 10,000. And there you go. So that gives the buyer a great return. It makes the housing market accessible to folks, and that's the friggin' point. That is the fundamental idea, to make the housing market accessible to people who would not otherwise have access to it. And again, you can play around with how much of it is the third-party mortgage lender, how much of it is the institution, how much is the equity share, but the fundamental principle is right here. You allow people who couldn't otherwise enter to enter the housing market, and thereby make this home more attractive to them than it would otherwise be in the current configuration. So that's our story. That's pretty much the set of examples I know of. There may be others y'all may know about, and I think we'd be more than thrilled to take some questions. Are the chat things coming in to us here? Maybe I should look at those.
There's also a microphone available.
Good.
Somewhere up here. I was told there was a microphone that can float around, so if there are questions, it'd be great to be able to hear you. Yes, Jim. Can we get the
Yes,
microphone
Jim,
to?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
So I was asking if you could rattle off a list of the kinds of institutions that put up this kind of equity, and especially in the rural community where I work on neighbor islands where you don't have large medical groups, large numbers of employees. You mentioned banks, and so my second question with regard to banks is banks in Hawaii tend to be rather provincial. I can't say that we would do this, but would there be an issue with a bank that already has such a history mainland doing this in Hawaii?
So is this working? That's okay. Jim. You keep the mic. Maybe you take the mic, friend, and our little Sacred Heart person here, and you can distribute it. And you can hear this, right? This still works. So the question was, who would be in a position to put up this funding, and could banks who are not in Hawaii now come do it? Let me start with the first. Certainly, financial institutions are natural candidates because they understand the mortgage world already, and there are examples they could learn from even if they haven't done it themselves. I would also observe any institution with a kind of endowment or reserves. So you could imagine an insurer with reserves. They invest in everything, right? They invest in stock market, they invest in land, they invest in other stuff. Why not invest in housing? Again, you can work it out so that they should be able to make the kinds of returns in this investment as other real estate lenders do. But those institutions with endowments or with reserves are natural candidates as well. And then I would say, Jim, it's possible to imagine large employers. You know, I read about this whole notion of stock buybacks and that sort of stuff. It's going on all over, creating cash for corporations, which then turn around and invest. There's no reason this couldn't be an appealing investment strategy for any balanced portfolio, which gets you to, geez, what about the pension funds, right? And the answer is yes. Any financial institution could theoretically find this a very interesting and productive, mutually beneficial investment. What's the legality of, let's just say, Lending Tree coming into Hawaii and doing this? I don't know what the rules might be, but I'm certain that if it came to be an appealing option and the workforce sort of committee here, if you will, entertained these kinds of things, those kinds of arrangements could be worked out. Banks can enter geographic markets, but they always have to pay attention to the local rules. I know, for example, when I lived in Virginia, my bank was Wells Fargo. I didn't choose Wells Fargo. It bought a bank, which bought a bank, which bought a bank, which bought a bank where I put my money 40 years ago. But anyway, Wells Fargo's the bank I had when I left Virginia. Wells Fargo's not in Louisiana. I called them up when I moved. I said, why aren't you here? They said, well, have you heard of the Napoleonic Code? So there are reasons why people don't go into certain states. I don't think Hawaii has a Napoleonic Code, but they do have traditions, and I'm sure there's some rules that they'd have to follow. But yes, it's certainly imaginable you could. But what I would observe is, while financial institutions do tend to follow local norms, it's also true when you show them of profitable opportunity about which they may not have known or have not considered, then it's imaginable that they might be open to this sort of thing in a small part of their portfolio. And then once it's sort of seen to be successful, it can be a larger part of their portfolio. I'll just say no universities backed off from this, and they're all doing it still today because they have to in all these markets. So next question.
Yeah, I think she's going to bring the microphone to you.
If you don't have a mic, then people on Zoom won't be able to.
I just have a short comment. In Hawaii, housing, land is so complicated. Because land is held by a few entities, very our land. We're an island state, so we're very limited just in the land that does exist. And so you see really weird things happening, like at a time when ocean rise and challenging us, and we are really our challenge in terms of our food source in a way. Some of our very best agricultural lands have been paved over for housing. Okay, so we may have a house to live in if you're lucky enough to afford it, but in the next category 4 hurricane or higher, we could wipe out all of the distribution of food. So I think finances could be worked out. There's a larger issue of how we manage our resources overall. So yes, we need a housing coordinator, but I would really like for us to see a statewide kind of completely rational about how we use our resources. And I don't know, maybe work on that and come back next year because I would hate to see again.
Well, if I could just comment, just, I can certainly appreciate that there are geographic barriers to being able to expand housing. And I'll just note that I'm not sure if the better way to go is to say build up, right? But I'm certainly sure that that conversation happens here. I did notice as a casual observer that obviously the high-rise buildings are here and that they're a little less so outside of the downtown Honolulu area. And I'm not so sure how purposeful that has been. And it would worry me if that is a direction that people argue otherwise is to go up, but I'm sure that that's probably one way to go. The other thing I will just caution against is that in Seattle, what's been very common is to allow for multiple houses to be developed on what used to be a single house site. So some of the zoning laws have changed to allow multiple units to now be built basically behind a main house. So what has happened is that one might have a main house in the front, and then, I mean, I recognize land is quite limited here, but even there in some of these neighborhoods, land is a bit limited, and people build basically a unit on top of their garage, that accessory dwelling unit. I'm not advocating that this is a good idea, and it certainly has changed the nature and the character of some of the neighborhoods where people have torn down what used to be a smaller, cute one-family bungalow, and now what has arisen are like 4-unit mini condos. But I will say that that has been one solution that Seattle has been trying to implement in some parts. And I just caution that there's trade-offs for that. One is that you do get more people who can now occupy one land, but at the same time, it does change the nature and the character of a neighborhood considerably, especially if there's not any oversight in terms of how those construction looks. So you have like a mixed use of like very kind of craftsman style house next to a very modern boxy looking house. And this has been a tension in Seattle. And I don't know that I'm saying that this is a good or bad thing. I think but it certainly has been one approach that cities have taken. And if that is a direction that folks in Hawaii do want to take, I would say carefully look at some of these communities, like in Seattle, for example, where this is happening, because it has opened up more opportunities for people to live.
Well, that's a great point, Bianca, and I'm glad you mentioned Seattle, because I'm glad to hear Seattle has reduced the restrictions on multifamily. But specifically on the geography, I totally concur. I mean, everything I talked about at lunch is all about getting everybody in a room, and people who need to be in the room are the people who think about exactly those issues. And I don't know enough to be helpful, but I've got to read whatever you send me, so we'll go from there.
That's a very astute observation. Like big cities like Chicago, New York, when you can't go sideways, you go up. And one of the recent changes in the city has done is that they have shared costs with the developers. And what they do is they allow this urban area like around Honolulu. If you have a certain number of affordable units, you can build the rest income if you want to. And from what I've seen, or what my patients tell me, you get what you pay for. So when these developers build these mixed units, they kind of try to skim. Whenever you have this model, they'll try to keep the cost low. And literally, I've heard horror stories of the first 5 floors of a 40-story building where the drain pipes are solid rocks. They just solidify. And they're tearing a place apart, they're trying to fix it. You get what you pay for, so how do you incentivize, for to go with this model, but yet pay enough so you get a quality product?
If I have an answer for that, but I hate to say what the example that comes to mind is even for those who actually spend a lot of money on a house, doesn't necessarily guarantee a good building. I think about one example in San Francisco, which is where I was born and raised, is that there's a very, very pricey high rise that is sinking. It is sinking. I mean, it's leaning and sinking. It was poorly constructed. I think there's a larger housing kind of challenge in terms of how these are being developed. I mean, in DC too, I lived in Washington, DC for a while. And I know when I was looking for housing and they're eager to build lots of units to put more people in the district. And I noticed a number of places where the floors weren't quite level or the walls didn't quite meet the floor. And so that speaks to a kind of a larger construction issue. I mean, in terms of who is it who's monitoring the quality of the housing. So I certainly agree that what you kind of get what you pay for, but I will say that you will see these problems probably across the board, maybe not as obvious, but I'm concerned about rapid growth of housing generally in terms of what that means for quality control and who's actually looking after that.
I mean, there's no question that new housing requires new oversight. There's no question about that. I would observe that the low-income housing tax credit program has been around a pretty long time. And at least I know some people who are happy with it. Cleveland, Baltimore. And it has to do, I think, with a combination of the particular market need, the configuration of sort of how the incentive works, and the regulatory environments in those particular places. So I think, to be fair, yeah, back when there didn't have low-income housing being built, the regulatory regime here didn't worry about it so much, and now they need to. That may be what I'm learning here, but I think that's the way I would say it.
Can hear you.
Thank you for the discussion. This is the first two questions. It does sound like Oahu, that I, seems to be suffering from tragedy in the commons, limited land resources versus agricultural land. One thing I was hoping that we could discuss was creating residential units that are sold for prices beyond what your average resident can afford, even with shared equity. Seems like a little challenge for you guys.
Well, you're certainly right. You gotta pitch the level of the shared investment at something that's affordable to the target population you've got. And all I would say is that you're totally correct. If you don't pitch the level correctly, you're not going to get any takers, right? But all I would say is all the shared equity arrangements essentially try to do the following. They try to enable people to buy a house at less than the current market price. And you can set that degree as high or low as you think you need to go, right? And at some level, it really does depend upon, like what I imagine, for what it's worth. You might have one set of houses that would be available to doctors, and they might be expected to put up, 30% or something. And the medical assistants might be expected to put up 10. And so you have a kind of a sliding scale shared equity arrangement. The math can still work as long as you make it affordable and the income of the person can afford the payment that they have to make, right? So in principle, you can dial it up or dial it down as long as you've got a willing lender and a good credit rating.
I just want to address, I think one other issue, it seems like the islands are struggling with also are a lot of foreign investments in the area, right? A lot of people who are coming to buy property and they don't live in these properties. I know that in Vancouver, Canada, that has certainly been an issue in that city. They're not the only one, but Vancouver has certainly experienced an influx of foreign investment for people who don't live in a number of the buildings. And there has been a relatively recent tax that has been implemented on foreign investments. That does take considerable political will, and that is Canada, not the US. But it has had a significant effect on the housing market and availability of houses. And maybe there's something on the opposite side that rather than taxing the foreigners who might come in to invest is to alternatively give some kind of subsidy to incentivize or to allow developers to develop targeting local residents. But again, that takes a much more complex political conversation, but it is worth noting that that is a tool that has been used somewhat successfully elsewhere. Just a little bit.
And one of the things that's a problem for us here in Hawaii, and I think in all the islands, is that is so escalated that even most people, most healthcare professionals can't even afford that. But the other side was talking about developers building. Talking about the best use of building up three-story. And part of it is because of land. They're talking about the home running some big city, just waste of materials, land and whatnot.
That's a difficult one. My first thought is, so sounds like excuses from the developers. I mean, it does speak a little bit to what are the incentives in place that, you know, get them to be willing to develop. And it sounds like there wasn't enough there. So they're going to say that it wasn't worth it. It didn't quite pay off. But to that first comment about just having the down payment just being even larger than probably a 1-year salary, say, of a medical assistant. I mean, I personally care a lot about those assistants and aides who make on average like somewhere between $30,000 to $40,000 a year, and do they even have any opportunity to even buy anything? I mean, that's certainly an issue even on the mainland. And as I heard on today's morning's panel with, I know Jim was on there too, that there was this acknowledgement that they're seeing high turnover of medical assistants. You know, there's like two or three less medical assistants on staff in many of these clinics. And I know we don't talk enough about what kind of means are available for folks even at that level to be able to live anywhere close to their work. And I'm worried a little bit that combined with the lack of public transportation, there are good options. They're really being pushed out quite far and traveling much longer, and to be able to find anything affordable. And this does just become more of a, I think, as Len said earlier, we have to just have that conversation. And I see that this cannot happen only insularly within the healthcare industry, right? I mean, you have to find other willing partners around the around the community outside of healthcare to have those conversations. And again, I go to the Workforce Development Board because in some ways there is some public funding behind that to at least bring the people together and have a reason to have this conversation. Now they are generally more driven by supporting people who want to go on a career pathway of becoming a nurse or a physician, and they have a little less of a focusing on those who become aides and assistants. But I like that highway kind of analogy that Len used earlier, that, well, medical assistant might be on the pathway of something kind of better paid longer term. So all this to say, I mean, somehow there needs to be more of a conversation of also having targeted subsidies for those who make below some amount of money, who work and dedicate their lives to healthcare in particular. I mean, much like teachers also, I think there are some programs out there to help subsidize some loans for teachers out there. And I think healthcare workers at all levels, all the way down to assistants, should certainly be part of that conversation. I do see that there's a question here on chat, so that someone's asking for, actually maybe I see two, would Hawaii be more open to the tiny house that is more of a recent fad that has become more popular? And the other one I think was kind of answered, but that's more of a question for you all. The tiny house movement, if you're not familiar, is just literally a tiny house. It's almost like a little 1-bedroom studio, but in a house version. Yeah. There's certainly a NIMBY problem, not in my backyard problem. Again, in Seattle, I've seen these housing communities and they are kind of cordoned off. We have a big tent problem for homeless in Seattle. So, and I know many other cities certainly struggle with this, but Seattle and San Francisco certainly have a huge homeless problem. And so tiny houses have certainly come up as a community, as an option as a solution. But mostly what that has been that the tent cities have just been replaced by these small houses. So you still have the same social problems that many homeless struggle with, that you need to figure out actually how to embed maybe a social worker in those communities to actually make some of that thrive. And so I'm just saying that I guess these small houses have been kind of targeted towards certain populations which have been homeless. I don't know if that's been worked very well to apply and build small houses for a kind of broader community. So. Yeah. Yeah. I'm looking at just a couple other notes here that came through on chat. One says, would shared equity work in Hawaii? Would shared equity work in Hawaii, where existing and sometimes really old single family homes are selling for a median of $1 million and condos for $500,000? That's kind of been answered. And then someone else mentions here that they had attended an org code training and found out that tiny homes actually cost 62% more per square foot than regular homes. That's interesting. That kind of goes back maybe to the materials comment that was made earlier. Other questions?
I have a follow-up question for you. Going forward, okay, with the interest rate going up, and I've never seen a 0.75 increase, but I've seen this past week. They think that buyers are going to pull back a little bit, and that's going to stunt the housing industry. How do you see? Do you think is a positive outlook or negative outlook for models like this?
For those online who are listening, the question is about the rising interest rate and what that might be doing for the pool of buyers. Here, I'll let you get
So thanks for that really easy question. I think it's fair to say that I've never seen a 0.75 increase by the Fed either. I think it's fair to say we should take Chairman Powell's words for what they were. And he said, no one knows if this is going to really end without a deep recession. I believe, 100 years ago, I was also a macroeconomist. I believe what he's trying to do is to show the markets he's serious about inflation in order to, if you will, wring inflation expectations out of the economy quicker than a deep recession would. So it's a gamble. It's a gamble that might work. It might not. He, in his wisdom and his board of governors, thought it was worth taking. What does it mean in the long run? Well, that's why lendingtree.com or landing, whatever the thing was. Yeah, the other one is on, you know, hold, right? Everything's waitlisted. So no question, rising interest rates makes lenders pull back, makes buyers pull back, all that stuff. We are talking about a longer run solution where at some level, the point of all of it is to get the net interest rate, net payment down to an affordable level for the health professionals and other professionals, other human beings you're targeting. That's why we think it has to go beyond housing. You can't get political support for subsidizing homes for doctors and leave everybody else out. So there's got to be a more, if you will, comprehensive approach. I just think that what the Fed is doing right now is designed precisely, almost like trying to strike with a surgical scalpel the inflation in the economy and try to do it and get out. That is to say, lower rates quicker than they would otherwise be able to avoid a deep recession. I don't know if he's going to succeed. I sure as hell hope so. Go ahead. Let's talk.
Is there a microphone? Oh, sorry, we got a microphone back there. Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, it is.
Saying that they're not homeless, they're not homeless. Why use your home? That is a house. And the other issue is that the Hawaiian word for land is aina. The earth will provide sustain yourself. That was what aina was all about. Problem is, that's a concept. This is a commodity. Like dirt, paid over, cemented over, and you make millions off of it. And the problem that I have with shared equity is that no matter how much separated from whatever this profession, the issue is always going to have somebody who want to live here and somewhere is going to help you move that apple. They're putting up like 30-story buildings, and like they're going from millions, hundreds to millions, and even the sheer equity. Find somebody who's going to be really.
You make very good points. I couldn't agree more. And I would say that's why maybe in the Hawaiian context, something like that community land trust idea that cities have used to basically say, okay, this public land, we're going to build houses and you will not be allowed to sell at market rates. You can only sell to, if you will, the target class of people and at a rate comparable to below market that you got to buy it for. So you prevent speculation, sir, by law. That's the only way to stop speculation. I remember way back when I was young and my son was 4 or 5, we went to Banff, Canada. And Banff, Canada is a wonderful place to visit. They have elk floating through the town. It's quite idyllic. And they had a rule up there, and they set the rule in place because of movie stars moving in and buying houses. They had a rule that if you didn't work there, you couldn't own a house there. And it shut down the movie star market right away. And so I'm just saying, if you want to prevent that external speculation, you're going to have to set up a protected class, which can be done, but it requires law. There's no alternative to that. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to comment on Ed Luder's comment. They charge 25%. If you sell a property in Vancouver and you're not a resident, it seems like we could be doing that with people that aren't residents here that have vacation rentals. So just to disincentivize mainlanders or residents from purchasing investment properties. The other thing I was gonna mention is that, when I talked to Bianca about it earlier, there's really no limit on the equity split, right? I mean, you can have that $200,000 house and have someone own 50, the equity partner own 50%. And the house for half price, even though you only own half the house, but you own half the house and you have the option to buy it later on. Right. Correct.
In essence, it allows you to play in the market at a lower rate. That's what it's.
One of my questions, aside from the agricultural lands and such, Josh Green had talked about freeing up state lands to build housing on. Would that work? What is preventing loss of agricultural land? There's a huge need. To try to take us on there. Try some of these principles. A small test change. I would look for a place where you could try, to identify that as parking lot in agriculture. That is in an area where we are resource poor, and can we build the housing? Principles to see if the working way.
I think I saw a hand over here. Someone could get him the microphone.
Hi. I want to expand the conversation a little bit, just to ask you to speak to economists who are. How would it change if there was a livable basic universal income?
I mean, that I think could help. I'll just use an analogy where I worry about whether it helps healthcare. So I'm all for raising wages to get to a more livable level. And again, I'll just use Seattle as an example, but this certainly is the case anywhere else, is that there's a fight for a $15 minimum wage.
Not livable.
Sure, but it is better than where it is. But just hang with me about like what my concern is, which is that if everybody wages rise up, it doesn't necessarily help healthcare specifically, right? Because now, I mean, for me, one of my concerns is that now everyone has, it's good for society, but it's not good for healthcare in particular. There's no benefit that healthcare particularly gets, because now everybody can kind of move around to different jobs elsewhere. Like what I worry about, for example, is retention. And I think housing we're talking about as maybe a example of a retention issue for people staying in healthcare, meaning doctors and nurses, for example. But just as much as our medical assistants, we need to figure out how to retain them and have them be able to afford what they need here. But when everyone else is also having their wages raised, there's no competitive advantage that they now have as a medical assistant, for example. And so I do think it can help. I just don't think it is the only answer. So I think it's one of many things we should be considering and is useful. My only concern is whether that actually helps healthcare in particular.
Yeah, I would just observe, again, you asked for an economist. So it's on balance the right kind of thing to do. It would probably have the effect of enabling more people to afford more stuff, which in the short run, without increased supply, could actually drive up rent. So I think what I like to think about is sort of all these different buckets. One bucket is how can we increase purchasing power of people, which a universal basic income would do. So would a much higher livable minimum wage kind of thing. How do we increase the supply of stuff we want to make sure people have? And that is maybe a separate question, because if we don't also invest in supply, you're going to end up with people suddenly crossing the MIT threshold and not having enough housing either, right? And just bid up rents and so forth. So you need to work on supply as well. So what I would say is there's kind of maybe a 4 variable equation here. One is, what is the wage? One is, what is the supply of stuff we want to make sure people have, public schools, et cetera. Another is, what are the subsidy rates for different people? Because we probably still going to have to subsidize some stuff for somebody, right? And the fourth variable, which we don't talk about much, but we should, what is the tax rate that we apply to people of means? I mean, when you get right down to it, you can either pay people more and they can buy what you think they need as long as you pay attention to supply. You can subsidize people with taxes, or you can use taxes to build the supply. So there's lots of different ways this is all in play. You might have noticed all of it requires serious consultation about what kind of world we want to live in. What kind of redistribution do we think is necessary to have that world? And that's a conversation in essence politics is for, but we haven't been really good at having that conversation lately. However, I think it's at the place now, and you certainly are at a place in Hawaii where you're having the conversation, just not with all the cards on the table. So let's talk about the foreign investor problem. By the way, that problem is not unique to Hawaii. We already mentioned Vancouver, New Orleans, where I live. It's a big issue. People coming in, buying homes, renting them out for Mardi Gras and Jazz Fest, rent them out for 3 months a year, pay off the mortgage. You may have seen The Economist, which is the magazine that's published in England, but it's very savvy. I highly recommend it. It just had an article about private equity buying up housing all over the country because rents have been increasing, family level rents have been increasing like 25% the last 2 years. So they see it as a huge investment opportunity, just purely moving capital into a market, which just increases the scarcity for people trying to buy their own house. So all I'm trying to say is there are 4 variables in question. You need to think about all of them at the same time.
I'm not sure where the microphone is at this point in time. I saw maybe a hand back over there, Orange. Did you have a question earlier? Yeah.
Good answer.
Okay. All right. Let's see if there are any other questions online.
Any of our students
Oh.
have questions?
I'll just ask, there's one other comment here that said, if supply increases, so does waste, if not done sustainably, which doesn't necessarily help anyone, including the environment. Which I would certainly agree and not disagree. I think that, you know, my feeling from this conversation is that I think Len and I are hopeful in at least sparking a conversation, but we certainly don't have answers. And this is, I think, if anything, an opportunity for us to at least share that these are challenges are certainly shared countrywide. And I think the public good statement that Len really articulated this lunchtime, I think is a good one, because I do think it takes a collective effort to think through as a whole of the healthcare industry to say, hey, if you want healthcare, if you want healthy people on this island, you have to invest in the actual healthcare workers before they leave. I mean, this is a public good that's just, our healthcare workers are feeling burnt out. And it certainly is a feeling that is experienced across the country, that our healthcare workers are saying that they're leaving, they're going to leave soon. We don't see a lot of numbers that would suggest that they're leaving quickly or immediately, but certainly that sentiment is there, and it might be might show up in other ways, right? Like lower healthcare quality might be delivered over time. We might see reduction in hours, which would certainly have the same effect as losing people. And I think that argument is coalescing, getting a little bit better nationally. And so one can hope that this starts to resonate and that people will actually listen. Now, I'll say one thing on recessions. While I certainly don't want to see a recession happen, is that the one slight upside of that is that healthcare generally does better during those times. That health spending tends to go up, but more importantly for workers, they have fewer job options actually. And so healthcare oftentimes actually provides a continuous supply of jobs during recessions. So oftentimes I get asked the question of whether or not we're going to see a shortage in the future for any of the professions in this near future, and a recession will certainly change some of the equation, one of it, which is whether or not there are other jobs available for healthcare workers to go to. I'm not saying that's great, because that does mean also that people have to maybe accept work conditions that they may not otherwise want. And while we still have an opportunity to capitalize on this crisis to say, hey, let's solve something, it seems like now is the time to try to come together. And listening to the fact that you have a governor who has a medical, or a governor candidate, gubernatorial candidate, who has that medical background, is certainly an opportunity to kind of raise awareness for healthcare and use him as that recruiter in chief, as he said, or retainer in chief, because really that's what we need to do. And that's what we're talking about here today, mostly, is how to figure out how to retain the workforce rather than recruiting. See just one last comment, which is a note to my comment, which is a recession doesn't allow for healthcare wages to increase or money from the government to increase. Certainly that's the case. It's just mostly the lack of other options. And I certainly think it's worth taking a note in terms of what other industries are doing to try to attract workers into their sphere, because, you know, as others mentioned over there, that low wages or lack of housing, these are not issues isolated to healthcare. These are issues that are experienced across many industries. So what are, you know, it's worth talking to other colleagues across the industry, across the economy, to say, hey, you know, food service, how are you retaining your workers? Hospitality, how are you retaining your workers? Because these are the same issues that we're seeing across the economy. Are there any other questions? If not, yeah. Oh, there we go. Yes, please.
Well, short answer is I don't know. I think that, you know, one of the things we suggested earlier was hire a workforce coordinator in every healthcare organization that needs to recruit a large number of people or retain, and that's every single one of them. There are a number of different programs. Most of the existing programs for housing assistance are tied to income, but they are available to all comers whose income qualifies. And given the nature of housing costs, I think there's adjustment for that in some of these programs. So it's possible you could qualify for housing assistance right now, and no one in this room or in this city knows it. But there are people who can find that out for you. So that's step one, find out what's available now. And to do that, you need professionals, and, you know, you got housing authorities and so forth who can help you do that, I'm sure. But the second thing, which seems like a natural next step, is to begin having a group meet and talk about solutions. I love this pilot idea. I think that's brilliant. I think the notion of working out a pilot within Hawaii's own structures now, And you could, do it as soon as you have a politician willing to make it happen. Have that pilot come into existence over the next year or two. In the next 6 months, I don't know what to tell you, other than to look for what's available through existing programs, which you can find out, I'm sure, from your local Hawaii Housing Authority. But those options were created largely, like the low-income housing tax credit program, all the Section 8 stuff, all of that was created for lower income people in general. And you might have heard this rumor, there's a lot of waiting lists all over the country. Those low-income housing tax credits are allocated to each state based upon a formula, based upon income and so forth. And as I understand it, the developers typically bid for those credits because they can use them to offset profit from more high rent buildings or high condo type buildings. And there's a shortage of those credits. That is to say, they bid for these things in every state. There's so many profitable opportunities to offset. So there's a shortage in general. I don't know how to solve it in the short run.
I'll just add that this is a great group. I mean, you're here in this room taking your Saturday to talk about workforce issues, and it seems like there's an opportunity to create some subgroups to tackle some of these complex issues and figure out how to find shared agendas across different health professions. And I think housing is certainly one of these things that is a shared concern across multiple occupations, and figuring out how to get some of the state medical societies together to advocate for some solutions or come up with a menu of solutions is at least one step forward if that's not already happening. Because I think with each health profession going it alone is not going to be as successful as having multiple health societies come together. And I think the other one is I would look at the employers or talk to employers and say, well, how much are you spending on recruitment? Because recruitment is very expensive, and it's generally thought to be more expensive than retention. So how much are you losing by recruiting workers versus just retaining workers? And can you take some of that difference and help put that towards something like a housing subsidy, even if it's for a rent subsidy? And those kinds of calculations, I think, are not done enough. I certainly couldn't point to you very easily recent papers that actually have even calculated out the cost of recruitment versus retention, but you certainly hear it from employers that they recognize that recruitment is much more expensive than retention. And so maybe one way to help retain workers is to figure out what that differential is and figure out, well, would you be willing to put some percentage of that towards helping your current workers afford housing so that maybe they'll stay in this industry just a little bit longer. And I think that's something every employer could spend a little bit of time looking at their books to figure out what that takes, because recruitment is not just just finding the person, but it's the onboarding. It's the years of experience that you lose, when you have somebody who has retention, when you're addressing retention. And that is a harder thing to probably put a number on, is like, what is the dollar value of losing a worker that's experienced to somewhere? Because that is a very important value that I think is being taken advantage of very much in this current state.
Excellent point, Bianca. And it reminds me of the one thing on the chart I hope you could see, in the chart of the Hospital Association list of vacancy rates and so forth, the turnover rate of some of these professions. And the one I remember most specifically was phlebotomists. The turnover rate for phlebotomists in Hawaii was like 32% per year. And they're paid something like $17 an hour. So the cost of recruiting is probably more than they cost to hire. I mean, it's amazing. Yeah. I think we might have exhausted your energy level and your curiosities as well. And so I think we can yield back what was remaining of our 8 minutes of time, but it's been our honor to try to lead you in this discussion and hope to inspire you to create that pilot and make this work before we come back. Thank you very much.
I just looked at health industry, the service industry, impact police, however, first source of cash. It's gonna be- Just for fun, like your mom, you can- basically, oh my goodness. You're perfect.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you for your
Just,
Yeah, no, it's shocked. I was shocked to see.
I'm not sure if that's a